Okay, so let's see what issues we have today. So when I go to compile my program, I get a ton of errors, so lots of compiler errors. It's a big program. Um, and look, still some more errors. So lots of errors to go through, as you can see. But we're going to take them one at a time. So what's this first error? And by the way, we already dealt with a bunch of errors associated with the Riddle class the other day. So we've dealt with those, now we're moving on. So what's the error we have here? Well, let's see. We have an error associated with the chapter.h class in member function void chapter scope resolution operator display excerpts. So basically in the display excerpts function associated with the chapter class, we have no match for the insertion operator. You can read all this, but basically what it says is I'm trying to output to the console, so standard output. I'm trying to output using the insertion operator excerpt. The problem is that the insertion operator is not defined for user-defined classes inherently. Okay, it is for primitive types like ints and bools and floats and doubles and all that sort of stuff and strings. But excerpt is a user-defined class, something I made up, so it's not naturally defined. So there's a couple options we can do to fix this. One, we go to my user-defined class. Well, first of all, where's the error happening? It's happening in chapter, and it's happening right here. You can see the little red squiggly line because I'm trying to output E, which is an excerpt. You see, it's an excerpt class, and again, the insertion operator isn't naturally defined for it. So I have to go a couple different ways I could do it. One, I created these functions called toString methods, which basically, if I call the toString method on an excerpt object, it'll return text. And what is text? Well, it's the instance variable right here. It's a std_string instance variable. It's just select text for the extract. So, and that's fine because this is a standard type. A std_string is a standard type in C++. So, when my toString method returns string, or correction, returns text, it's returning a string. That way, this is ultimately, so if I go .toString, that's now returning a string text, the private instance variable associated with the excerpt object, which is text, which is of type std_string. And because of that, well, the insertion operator is defined for primitive types and strings in C++, so this will work. So that's one way to solve the issue. If I was to save this and then recompile this code, we'll see this issue goes away. We'll still have all these other issues. So clear the screen, CLS, clear the screen. I'll still have all the other issues, tons of issues. But I don't have that display issue. See, we have a different issue. That's one way to solve it. That's not the best option, though. So that's more of a Java thing. The toString method, I overwrote it just to, because I'm doing comp 308 at the same time. So I'm kind of in a Java C++ hybrid mood. But if I don't want to do it that way, I want to do it more of the C++ idiom, I would instead overload the insertion operator. So I had to comment it out here. And so basically, you write the keyword operator, and then whatever operator you want to overload. It could be any operator. It could be plus, negative sign, plus equals, the insertion operator, extraction operator, all these, any operator, right? Ampersand, anything. But in this case, this is a very common one to overload when we ever use defined classes. We overload the insertion operator, and then we pass in two arguments. The first one being an outstream object. So an outstream object, std_outstream, passed by reference. Being passed by reference is important. We don't want to copy. We want to actually get an outstream object because we're ultimately going to return an outstream object by reference as well, and we want to return the same one. And the second thing we pass in is an excerpt, whatever the class is that we're in, and we're in the excerpt class. We want to pass in an object of type excerpt by constant reference. So why are we passing the outstream object just by reference and passing the other thing by constant reference? Well, we're not going to be changing this at all. So we want to be clear and let the computer know and the compiler know, hey, we're not going to change it. You can let us see it. We're just going to print it. We're not going to do anything. But we are changing the outstream object, so we're actually going to print something to it. Outstream, insertion operator, eText. So we're actually changing it. That's why it can't be constant. And why does this work? Well, output stream is just whatever output stream we passed into this function. It's going to be C out, in this case, the console. And then the insertion operator is just working on e.text. But I already told you that e.text is of type stood string, and we know the insertion operator works on primitive types and stood string. So this works. So that's what we're going to do. And we return that as an object. And it's a friend method just so that way this can be called outside of the class and it doesn't have to be called on an excerpt object like using dot notation like e dot toString was. This just works, and by having it a friend method, it can be called outside of this class, and wherever it's called, it'll have access to the private variables of the excerpt file. That's what the friend does. So basically, if I uncomment that, save this, go back to chapter, you'll see I don't have the toString method on here, so it's just the way it was originally when it was screwed up. But now there's no squiggly line. Why? Well, because I have overridden that insertion operator, so it will work. So again, we still don't have the error here, which is good. So that was one error. The second error that we had was that I got rid of. I didn't show it here, but I was... You know what? I'm going to bring the error back just so we can see it. First, I'll end the video, and then we'll show that error.